What happens when the most calculated woman in politics loses control? It was a question no one expected to answer, least of all Karoline Leavitt herself. But on a chilly Thursday morning in Washington, D.C., the answer unfolded in real time, live-streamed to millions. And it wasn't pretty. The room was packed, the air thick with the hum of anticipation. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens poised, cameras trained on the podium. Karoline Leavitt, the Republican strategist known for her razor-sharp wit and unflinching composure, stood at the center of it all. She was there to deliver a speech on campaign finance reform, a dry topic she'd turned into a rallying cry. But what happened next had nothing to do with policy, and everything to do with power. The room, usually a stage for rehearsed sound bites and carefully curated messages, became a battleground. The tension was palpable, the stakes higher than anyone could have anticipated. And when Karoline finally spoke, her words cut through the room like a thunderclap, leaving everyone, reporters, aides, and viewers at home, stunned into silence. This wasn't just a press conference anymore. It was a moment that would redefine her career, for better or worse. Karoline had arrived early, as she always did. She'd spent the morning rehearsing her lines in the mirror, adjusting her navy blazer, and smoothing her hair into its signature sleek bob. She'd even practiced her smile, the one that said, "I'm in control, even when I'm not." But as she stepped into the briefing room, something felt off. The energy was different. The usual murmur of reporters chatting, the clatter of keyboards, the occasional burst of laughter, it was all there. But there was an undercurrent, a tension she couldn't quite place. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on a familiar face in the third row. Marcus Trent, a veteran journalist known for his relentless questioning and his knack for getting under people's skin. He was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. Karoline's stomach tightened. She didn't trust smirks. Marcus had a reputation for ambushing politicians, for turning press conferences into spectacles. And today, she could feel it. He was waiting for his moment. She took a deep breath, straightened her notes, and stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent. The cameras clicked. And then she began. The speech began as planned. Karoline's voice was steady, her delivery flawless. She talked about transparency, accountability, the need to rebuild trust in the political system. She cited statistics, quoted experts, and even threw in a carefully timed joke that earned a few polite laughs. But then, halfway through, Marcus raised his hand. Not to ask a question. No, he didn't wait for that. He interrupted her mid-sentence, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Karoline," he said, leaning forward, "how do you square all this talk of transparency with the fact that your party's biggest donor just got slapped with a federal indictment?" The room froze. Cameras swung toward Marcus, then back to Karoline. She blinked, her jaw tightening. This wasn't part of the script. She could feel the weight of the room's attention, the collective intake of breath. For a split second, she considered deflecting, offering a canned response about due process and the importance of separating individuals from institutions. But something about the way Marcus was looking at her, like he'd already won, made her blood boil. She stepped away from the podium, her heels clicking against the floor. "Marcus," she said, her voice low but sharp, "if you'd done your homework, you'd know that donor was cut off months ago. But I guess facts don't matter when you're chasing a headline, do they?" The room erupted in whispers. Marcus's smirk faltered, but he didn't back down. "Funny," he shot back, coming from someone who built her career on spin. Karoline's eyes narrowed. She was used to attacks, but this felt personal. And in that moment, something inside her snapped. "You want to talk about spin, Marcus?" she said, stepping closer to him. "Let's talk about the story you buried last year. The one about your buddy on the city council taking kickbacks. Oh, wait, that never made it to print, did it? I wonder why." The room went dead silent. Marcus's face turned red. "That's not," he started, but Karoline cut him off. "No, let's finish this. You want to question my integrity? Fine. But don't pretend you're some paragon of journalistic virtue. We both know better." The cameras were rolling, capturing every second. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances. This wasn't just a press conference anymore. It was a showdown. Karoline's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She hadn't planned for this, hadn't rehearsed it in front of the mirror that morning. But now that she was here, she wasn't going to back down. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Karoline didn't give him the chance. "You want a story, Marcus? Here it is. You're not the hero in this room. None of us are. But at least I'm not pretending to be." The room erupted again, this time in a cacophony of voices. Reporters shouted questions, cameras clicked. Furiously, and somewhere in the back, an aide dropped a stack of papers. Karoline stood her ground, her eyes locked on Marcus. For the first time in years, she felt completely, unapologetically herself. By the time Karoline walked out of the room, the clip was already trending. Leavitt v. Trent was everywhere, dissected on cable news, memed on social media, debated in op-eds. Some called her brave for standing up to a bully. Others accused her of crossing a line. Karoline didn't care. She'd said what she needed to say. But as she sat in her office later that night, scrolling through the endless commentary, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd played right into Marcus's hands. He'd wanted a story, and she'd given him one. Her phone buzzed. Incessantly. Texts from colleagues, calls from reporters, emails from supporters and detractors alike. She ignored most of them, focusing instead on the video that had been playing on a loop in her mind. Had she gone too far? Maybe. But in that moment, it had felt necessary. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet. Now, the chaos of the day replaced by a heavy, contemplative silence. She knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 2 days later, Karoline found herself at a small coffee shop across town, far from the prying eyes of the press. She was nursing a latte, staring out the window, when Marcus walked in. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then, to her surprise, he sat down across from her. "You know," he said, stirring his coffee, "you're not as bad as I thought." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" He shrugged. "Take it however you want. But for what it's worth, I didn't come here to fight." Karoline studied him, trying to figure out his angle. But for once, his smirk was gone. "Why did you come then?" she asked. He leaned back in his chair. "To ask you something. Do you ever wonder if we're all just playing the same game, but on different sides?" Karoline didn't answer right away. She thought about the press conference, the way the room had erupted, the way she'd felt in that moment, alive, but also exposed. "Maybe," she said finally, "but that doesn't mean I'm going to stop playing." Marcus nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "Fair enough," he said. "But just so you know, neither am I." They sat in silence for a while. Two adversaries sharing a table, each lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't a truce exactly, but it was something. As the story of Karoline and Marcus spread, it sparked a larger conversation about power, accountability, and the lines we draw, or cross, in the heat of the moment. But here's the question. In a world where every word can be weaponized, how do we hold on to our humanity? What do you think? Share your thoughts below. Let's keep the conversation going. Was Karoline right to call out Marcus, or did she cross a line? And in a world where perception often trumps reality, how do we navigate the fine line between standing our ground and losing ourselves? Let's hear your take.